Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are joining us today. My name is Scarlett Reynoso, and on behalf of Ethisphere, I am pleased to welcome you to the live webcast of benchmarking ethics and compliance programs across an enterprise. Over the next hour, you'll hear from my colleagues Erica Salmon Byrne and Jonathan Whitaker as they discuss best practices for benchmarking an ethics and compliance program to meet international guidelines and evolving business requirements. If you have ever joined us for an Ethisphere webcast before, you know we love to take your questions and answer them throughout the presentation to make today's session more of a discussion with you. Please use the chat feature in the webcasting platform. Our goal for every webcast is to encourage you to ask any questions you may have. We are anticipating a handful of questions today, so we will try to answer as many as we can, and if we happen to run out of time, we will follow up with you via email. Following the live webcast, you will receive an email from us, including the recording of today's webcast and PowerPoint presentation. I will quickly introduce our speakers before diving into today's session. As I mentioned, we are joined by my colleagues at Ethisphere, Erica Salmon Byrne, Executive Vice President and Chair of BELA, and Jonathan Whitaker, Executive Vice President of Ethisphere Services. Jonathan, Erica, the floor is all yours.
Wonderful.
Great, thank you. Oh, please go right ahead, Erica. Go ahead.
So this is going to set a pattern for everybody. Jonathan and I are so excited to be on the line with you all today that we will be talking over each other for the course of the next hour. We'll do our best to get it sorted out. But I just wanted to say thank you, Scarlett, and to emphasize a point that Scarlett just made, which is we really do mean it when we say we want to take your questions. As many of you who have been on webcasts with me in the past know, I am frequently interrupting both myself and my co-panelists to answer questions from the floor. So please do send them in via that chat function that you see in the bottom of your screen. And Jonathan, thanks so much for joining me today.
Yes, thank you all. We're really excited to present with you all today, talking a little bit more about the organization and what we're seeing in the market when it comes to benchmarking and measuring program effectiveness. Our organization has done a lot of this work in the past as we have built an advisory services practice based upon the data that we've collected over the years through the world's most ethical application process. So often companies in the market, as we're out there talking with them, are really interested in what best practice really is, how their program compares to that, and really what the best practice is to assess their program on a continuous basis. So that's the heart of today's conversation. What we'll do is we'll talk about, as you see in front of you, a little more background on the data set that we bring to the framework for program assessment and benchmarking. We'll talk a little bit about why organizations are benchmarking, the regulatory concerns and expectations, use cases for benchmarking, and then we'll present a new framework that we're just launching for Program Maturity Index. We'll give you some insight into what that experience is, what the output is, and how the companies that are part of our pilot program, how they are envisioning using this framework to help them as they plan for their program and help with their oversight responsibilities. So before we get into that, just a little bit of contextual setting here, or context setting. For those of you who are not intimately familiar with Ethisphere, just a quick introduction. I'll take 2 minutes here. So the organization, Ethisphere, we were started roughly 13 years ago now. First with a magazine to create a forum to speak with the ethics compliance community, sharing best practices, shining a light on the good things that companies were doing. Many of you still get the magazine. It goes out on a quarterly basis, both electronically and in print. Shortly after the magazine, 13 years ago, we started the World's Most Ethical Companies Recognition Program. And each year we have hundreds and hundreds of companies that go through that process and complete a questionnaire, really extensive, covering all components of the ethics and compliance program, plus content on their corporate social responsibility and sustainability initiatives, corporate governance, ethical culture, corporate reputation, and so on. The reason we just want to touch on that for a moment is because that serves as the underpinning for creating a data set that's unique in the industry, and which serves as the vehicle for us to provide advice and counsel to so many companies each year on how their program compares. So as you see here in the middle, that measurement component is really the piece of our advisory services business that Erica and her team really focus on. So we engage with companies on a continuous basis, helping them measure either their enterprise ethics and compliance program against best practice, or focused engagements around topics as you see in front of you here, their anti-corruption program, both internally as well as those in the value chain, measuring ethical culture of the business, and then specific risk topics like cybersecurity, protection of trade secrets and IP, and so forth. So the work we're doing around program maturity sits within that same kind of framework and business concept of measuring on ongoing assessment of your program against best practice. And the third piece of our business is called the Business Ethics Leadership Alliance, and that's really around community. So BELA, as we call it, is an association, a private consortium of now over 270 companies that come together both online and in person to share resources, share strategy, collaborate on their programs. And we do this on a global basis. It's in-person roundtable events. We'll do about 40 to 45 summits and roundtables around the globe this year. And as you see here, these are just some of the companies that are part of that association. And the reason we like to shine a light on that is because as we go out to the market and put together new solutions like the Program Maturity Index we're going to focus on today, it's really at the direction and with the insight that these member companies provide to us. So with that as a backdrop, I'll turn it back over to Erica to talk a little bit about what the data says and kind of what we're seeing in the market with some of the work that we're doing, and in fact, what we're seeing from the correlations between ethics and compliance and operational and financial performance.
Great, thanks, Jonathan. So just a couple of words here to set the stage for some of the data that I'm going to be sharing over the course of the next 50 minutes or so. And I'm going to start with why this data matters, this data set matters in the first place. You know, one of the things that we have been doing, as those of you who know us well are already aware, is we have been tracking the financial performance of the companies the publicly traded companies that we honor every year. And the reason for that is, you know, we believe very strongly that doing business the right way is actually good business, and that in the end, in the long term, those companies that do business the right way are going to financially outperform their competitors, and that is really the business case for the investment in time, energy, and resources that you all make on a regular basis. And that's really what the long-term stock chart analysis that we have done shows. So this is comparing those publicly traded companies on the list with overall large cap index performance over the course of the last 5 years on major US exchanges. And what you see is you do see exactly what I mentioned, which is that very particular correlation between companies that are doing business the right way and how they compare against broader, more mixed indexes that might be in use in the marketplace. So, you know, and I share this with you in this particular context for two reasons. One, I just love this chart generally. And two, you know, for those of you on the line who are wondering, how do I get the attention of my senior team to help them understand why I'm doing the work that I'm doing? For years, the answer to that was talking about fines and penalties and consequences. It is my firm opinion that you don't win hearts and minds with photos of people in handcuffs, and that the much better approach is to really make that business case. And so whether the correlation behind whether the causation underpinning this correlation is more engaged employees, it's lower employee turnover, it's stronger cultures, it's being able to invest in other things because you're not paying fines and penalties and some of your competitors are. You know, it's a whole kind of soup of causation underpinning this, but the correlation is very strong and very clear and has been over the course of the last decade that we've been doing this work. So I'm sharing it with all of you in the hopes that you find it useful and you can use this in those conversations where you're trying to make that case. Jonathan, we can just hop to the next slide. I want to give people a sense of the mix of companies that are in the data that I'm going to be sharing during the next kind of segment of the conversation that we'll be having. So this is a slide that shows you who's on the list for this particular year, for 2019. The data that I will be sharing in this particular slide deck is honorary practice. So the companies that are on the list and the work and the ways in which they structure their work is what I'm going to be showing you all. And so just to give a quick snapshot for you, and of course, since you're beginning the recording in the slides, you'll be able to look at this in greater detail. But you can see that it's a real mix of industries. It's a mix of sizes. It's a mix of revenues. And it's also a mix of ownership structures. So publicly traded is a majority, but we also have publicly held and nonprofit or other corporate setups. And we also, of course, have a good, solid representation around the globe. All right, so let's get into the data, which is why many of you join these kind of webcasts in the first place. So why are companies increasingly, when Jonathan and myself and the rest of the team out there talking to companies, why are they talking about benchmarking and assessing their program? And it's a mix of a couple of things. One, of course, is regulatory expectations. So whether it is the most recent set of regulatory guidance, whether it is the expectations that have long been in place, whether we go all the way back to DOJ Letter 0204, or we look at the Organizational Sentencing Guidelines, the Bribery Act, all of the guidance that has come out over the course of the last decade has talked about the importance of making sure that you have a risk-based and appropriately structured program for an organization of your size. Very easy thing for the government to write, more challenging thing for a compliance officer to figure out how to actually do. So how do you know that your program is risk-based? How do you know that it's effectively structured? Well, one of the ways to do that is to understand what your peer companies are doing. So whether you define peers by size, which many companies do, whether you define peers by revenue, whether you define peers by geographic reach, or you define peers by industry, understanding what the people who are in similarly situated situations to you, what kind of programs they have in place is one of the key ways that you can look at assessing whether you have what we call here and what the guidelines call a creditworthy program. And how are companies really doing that? So Jonathan, if you go ahead and jump to the next slide. What you have here in front of you is one of the questions from our ethics quotient, which is are you conducting a formal evaluation of the design and effectiveness of your ethics and compliance program? So again, this is something that we have seen in DOJ guidance. It was repeated in or referenced rather in the guidance that came out at the end of April. It was referenced in the guidance that just came out from the Antitrust Division, although they did use a slightly different structure, the way that they structured their guidance, but the primary elements that we are all familiar with from the Organizational Sentencing Guidelines and the fraud DOJ guidance are all in there and include understanding whether or not your program is working and whether or not you have the right elements in place. And one of the best ways, of course, to do that is to actually do a formal review. So what you see in front of you here is as I said, data from the honoree class showing that doing a periodic review separate from your risk assessment is a practice of a majority of companies. So whether it is doing the entire program periodically using internal resources separate from risk assessments, 70% of the group. Over half the group doing it as a part of a risk assessment, so looking both at the aggravating and the mitigating factors associated with a particular risk is one way of understanding the programmatic elements that are tied to that particular risk topic. So taking the anti-corruption as an example, looking at whether or not you have the right elements in place to programmatically mitigate the anti-corruption risk that you face as a result of the jurisdictions in which you're doing business. Very sensible way to structure a program assessment. Periodic evaluations of the entire program using external resources. So half the group is doing this. And again, this is a piece of regulatory guidance. The DOJ said, as I mentioned back in the early 2000s, in one of their opinion letters related to the anti-corruption program, they referenced the fact that having somebody come in from the outside on a periodic basis to look at your program is a best practice. The reason for that, of course, is that when you are heads down working on your program, it's very hard for you to put an objective set of eyes on the elements that you have in place. Also, of course, understanding what your peers are up to and somebody coming in from the outside will be able to provide you with those insights on how other companies are handling specific issues that you might be facing. And then a little bit over a quarter, of course, are looking at an ongoing process without a formal schedule. So it's a continuous process of evaluating programmatic elements. That is a decreasingly common answer as companies say we need to regularly step back and look at this holistically, especially as businesses change. So one of the things that, when we talk to companies about how they're structuring their programs, M&A activity obviously has a tremendous impact on the structure of the program. Bringing in new workforces as a result of acquiring a company, going into a new market, divesting a business, all of those things are going to impact your program. And so if you don't periodically step back, that's one of the challenges that you face. Great question that came in from the floor. Thank you for sending it in, which is this slides adds up to more than 100%. This is a multi-select question. So if you are a company that does both periodic external assessments and periodic internal assessments, you have the option to check both of those answers. And many companies do both periodic internal assessments and periodic external assessments. So that's how we get to more than 100%. Jonathan, if you could proceed to what topics companies are looking at when they do these kinds of assessments. So these are the 10 program element components that are most commonly evaluated during a program evaluation process. Looking at your code of conduct, does it still cover all the risks that we would expect our business to be facing? Are there particular risks that are less important than they were the last time we updated the code of conduct? Are there particular areas where employees are asking tons of questions? So, for example, we are seeing companies increasingly look at click metrics and other technologically enabled metrics that are giving them a sense of what employees are most concerned about. So if you have click-out scenarios in your code of conduct, for example, and one of them is around gifts and entertainment, and that particular click-out gets more hits than any other part of the code, the next time you go in to evaluate your program, you might very well say to yourself, well, people clearly have gifts and entertainment questions. Let's make sure that we give them the guidance that they need so that they have that guidance in place. The second most common is, of course, ethics and compliance policies, procedures, and guidance, including whether or not they've been recently updated. We worked with one client who looked at some of their policies, and they had not been touched since the 90s. And so that, for whatever reason, either the policy owner didn't feel like the policy needed to be updated, or it wasn't a particularly high priority risk. All of those things that might potentially be out there that would cause you to potentially need to update your policies. The other thing we're seeing a lot of companies look at right now is how are my policies structured, and is everything that is currently a policy need to actually be a policy? So, a lot of companies that are engaged in what we call policy simplification processes, looking at policy structure and whether or not everything that's out there actually has to be a policy. Another great question that came in from the floor, which is, what does periodic mean? So going back to the prior chart, how do companies think about looking at the program periodically? And so most often what we see is 2 to 3 years. The DOJ has said in that early 2000s opinion letter that having somebody come in from the outside to look at the program every 3 years is a best practice that they commended in that particular opinion letter as one of the things that caused them to say that the anti-corruption program in that case was strong. But often enough that you can roadmap your program for the next 3 years, but not so often that you're disrupting the actual operations of the program, is my answer to periodic. And that is going to change a little bit depending on the particular structure of your business. Third thing that companies are looking at is ethics and compliance training curricula. So again, is it keeping up with what I need to keep it up with? Organizational culture of ethics. Are my people speaking up where I expect them to speak up, using the channels that I expect them to use? Investigation processes. This is something that a lot of companies are looking at very hard right now. Do I have the right investigators in the right places, looking at the right things, and communicating back to employees about the investigation process? Because if I'm not, what we find again in the data is many employees feel like they raise a concern, it goes into a black box, and nothing ever happens. So that is becoming a very standard part of a periodic evaluation of the design of the program. Gifts and entertainment, of course, significant risk for a lot of organizations, something that a lot of employees have a lot of questions around. So looking specifically at the procedures and controls surrounding gifts and entertainment, whether or not they're appropriate for the business. And then same thing with conflicts of interest. So if you look at some of the interesting click metrics associated with compliance-related activities, one of the things that we see across companies is the two areas that most employees have the most questions around are gifts and entertainment and conflicts of interest. So it makes a tremendous amount of sense that companies are looking at that, particularly as they think about the assessment of their program. Some of the elements that play into doing a good assessment or benchmarking of the program, I'm going to go there next. So Jonathan, if you could go ahead and proceed with the slides. This is a development that we are seeing over the course of the last couple of years, and we actually added this question last year to the baseline ethics quotient survey because of the development that we're seeing on this front. So, and this really goes to the question of how is your program structured? Are you centralizing compliance where everything is coming out of headquarters, getting disseminated out to the business, and then filtering back up? Do you have a combined function where you have a staff at central headquarters that is dealing with kind of oversight pieces, and then you also have compliance personnel in the business who are very embedded with the business, but reporting back into the ethics and compliance function at headquarters. We call this in the business, but not of the business. Or is your program completely decentralized, in which case, by which I mean every business unit has their own independent compliance program, and there really is no significant centralization. So this is something that really plays into your questions for yourself about, how often should I be reviewing the design of my program? Does the design of my program make sense for the way my business is structured and growing? Or do I need to think about moving, as many companies have done, as you see in this slide here in front of you, to a combined program where I have a central staff at headquarters that is dealing with oversight of the compliance program, but a lot of the operationalization of the program is happening in the business with individual people who are dedicated, at least in part, to the operations of the ethics and compliance program. Great question that came in from the floor is to go back to the prior slide, Jonathan. You don't have to move the actual slide itself, but I'll just answer the question, which is how should companies be measuring the effectiveness of a code of conduct? What kind of metrics can help show the effectiveness of a code of conduct? Click metrics, obviously. So are people accessing the code? If you are in a position where you're fortunate enough that the majority of your employees have access to an electronic version, does it ever get actually hit inside of your intranet system? If so, which parts of the document get hit most often? Where are the policy click-throughs coming from? So if I'm accessing a particular policy through the code of conduct with particular regularity, that's one great metric. A lot of companies looking very hard at chatbots. So there are a couple of good chatbots out there that are associated with the code of conduct. They obviously provide you with tons of metrics in terms of the kinds of questions that companies or that employees are asking, rather. You can ask in the course of culture surveys or engagement surveys if employees are aware of the code and feel like it's a helpful resource. That's something that a lot of organizations are doing. Ask yourself, as part of your evaluation process, whether or not you can understand the language in the code, and if you think all employees at the company can understand the language in the code. So those are just a couple of examples of how to think about the effectiveness of a code of conduct. Great second question that came in from the floor. Thank you guys so much for sending in such great questions, which is, does this account for companies that have a department for ethics and a separate department for compliance? So the way the survey is structured, we instruct people at the front of the survey to look to answer structure questions like this one based on the structure of your ethics program. And so if you are in a financial services type business where that split between ethics and compliance is very common, then this would cover that. The instruction is to answer it for the ethics program. So that's really kind of the focus of it. And that, of course, that highly regulated space is the place where we most often see that particular kind of split. Jonathan, if we can hop to the next slide. So this is another place to think about, and I apologize that this one's a bit of an eye chart, guys, but I wanted to give you the trending lines, and you can find this in some of the written thought leadership that we have done over the course of the spring coming out of the data sets. So we have 3 insights reports that we have released over the course of the last couple of months. One of them is on program resources and structure, and so you'll have a more readable version of this particular chart in that particular report. But I really wanted to give you the trending here, because we've been asking this question for the last couple of years. And so what you see on the black line is the and keep me honest on this one. Yeah, the black line is the most recent, and the black line is the oldest, and the gray line is the most recent. So that's the way to read this chart. And the reason I wanted to share this in the context of this particular conversation is because of the significant input that we are starting to see compliance officers have in a couple of strategic places that I think have an impact from a benchmarking perspective. One of them is in product and supplier sourcing decisions. So as companies have become more and more aware of the impact and the risk that third parties present to their ethics and compliance program, that staff is getting more engaged in products and supplier sourcing decisions so that they can make sure that the individuals that the company is engaged with are those that share their values. So that is kind of halfway down the chart, and you can see that one is hovering this year at 95%, last year was 97%, but that's a 30% jump from 2015, so really significant growth there. The other one I wanted to highlight for all of you that has an impact from a benchmarking perspective is M&A activity and new market entry. So 89% of compliance teams report that they have significant input into the process for organizational business development decisions, such as M&A and new market expansions. And so again, this goes to this question of planning and benchmarking to make sure that you continue to have input and an understanding of where the company is going so that the program can travel along with it. And so, this goes into this idea that you are regularly looking at the design of the program because of the fact that you have a heads up on where the business is headed. And again, that's a change from 2015, and I would say it's a welcome change. So it's good to see the growth. Question that came in from the floor on the percentages there. So every year, the class of companies that make up the data set is a little bit different. And so that's how we see some of those slides in terms of the percentages that are involved in procurement and supplier decisions. I would say that 2% drop is really not meaningful, especially when you compare it to the 67% that we had just a couple of years ago. But that's the explanation for those kinds of slight variations in the data, is that the data set does change year over year. Jonathan, we go to the next slide just to be mindful of time. And again, this is another place where this benchmarking question comes into play, which is, what are the types of interactions that the function has with other, what I call sister control functions within your company? So are you part of the audit loop? How's your relationship with human resources? Can you add ethics and compliance related questions to other employee surveys that other parts of the business might potentially be engaged in? Are you providing formal input on corporate business strategy? And again, you see that one at almost 9%. So very exciting reflection of the seniority of many programs, and also, of course, something that plays into the question of how often are you benchmarking your program. So hopping to the next slide. This is another thing that plays into this question of looking at program structure and the ways in which you are able to use program structure to compare different parts of the business. So this is data on the number of companies that have what we call ethics and compliance liaisons. So these are not people who are inside of the ethics and compliance team. These are individuals who are often in other parts of the business, safety, HR, finance, local controllers, other individuals across the business who serve as your formal points of contact to help to share information that is coming out of the ethics and compliance program, particularly important when you think about that 56% who still have fully centralized programs. They don't have individuals necessarily in all of their regions who are doing ethics and compliance related work. So, so you have these liaisons, very common to see these programs. We have lots of great examples of companies that have done this successfully on the Bella Member Hub. But then how do you communicate with them, right? How do you actually make sure that they have the tools they need to be able to do the work that they do, or that you're asking them to do. And as of right now, this is a place where we see companies communicating primarily through email. So, limited use of specific software tools or platforms to be able to share information with these liaisons, and equally importantly, from our perspective, from a benchmarking and assessment perspective, figuring out what people are actually using. So if you put together a great toolkit on gifts and entertainment with upcoming holidays coming in a couple of different parts of the world, and you send them out to your ethics and compliance liaisons, how do you know that they've actually used them? How do you know that they've opened the files? How do you know they've downloaded them? How do you know they've used them? A lot of companies are chasing the liaisons to say, hey, did you find that helpful? Did you like that? Was that useful? What kind of feedback did you get from employees? But increasingly, companies are also saying, is there a technological way that I can figure out who's actually used what I've sent them, so that I follow up one way with those folks and a different way with the people who have not use those tools, or not downloaded or opened the information that I have given them. So using things like SharePoint to post documentation to, where you're then able to tell who's actually accessed the information that you've shared, things along those lines. We are seeing companies look at using things like some of the shared doc functionality that's out there. So creating a specific place on your intranet or on whatever system you guys are using to post for ethics and compliance liaisons, and then those liaisons can share materials with each other. So if I take the toolkit that you sent me and I'm based in Brazil and I tweak it for the Brazilian market, I can then upload it so that other liaisons can see how I may have tweaked those materials. This, of course, also applies, the same concept applies if you have ethics and compliance professionals that are in different parts of the business, or you have lawyers in different parts of the business who also wear an ethics and compliance hat, which is very common. You have someone who is the lawyer for your region in Brazil, and that person wears both an ethics and compliance hat and a legal hat, and you have tools you're sharing with them. Allowing those individuals to share with each other is another thing we're seeing a lot of companies look very closely at, and also figure out how to improve. So, Jonathan, if we can hop to the next slide. I will turn it over to you to talk a little bit about what we've done with the Program Maturity Index and how come we're seeing companies use that. And then I can promise you, periodically interrupt with color commentary.
Very good. Thank you, Erica. And so as we just walk through some of the data on how companies are periodically assessing and why, what you're seeing here is just access to the data that we have from the World's Most Ethical Companies Recognition Program. And as I mentioned at the start, Erica and her team are continually engaging with companies around the globe, helping them understand their programs in context to that data, and we're continually receiving requests for specific cuts of data. And for the Bella community, there's something called a focused fact. So if you have interest in insight from specific data points, we can certainly share that with you. Now, what's difficult for us, though, is to scale that approach across really a broad community and give companies ongoing access to comparison of their program against the data set. So that's really what the context of this Program Maturity Index really is creating a framework to benchmark your program against that data set and against the practices of leading companies. So when we were putting this concept together, we were out talking with the Bella member companies about their practices, their goals for benchmarking, and how they like to assess the maturity of their programs. And what we heard time and again was they were looking for an objective framework to assess that maturity based upon actual program practices rather than a subjective opinion-based approach, and then providing some context to the results of that assessment. And then if there was a way to provide some actionable guidance to advance the maturity, then that would really complete the package, really complete the vision of what they were hoping to achieve in a benchmarking or maturity assessment process. So that's exactly what we've done and produced here. And I'm going to show you here in just a second of what that looks like and what the output looks like. But essentially what we've done is we built a framework that enables a 5-level maturity assessment against best practice. And again, that best practice being how the world's most ethical companies have structured and implemented their programs around the globe. So that provides context to the specific maturity scores. And then second, as you see here in the middle here, we're focused on facts, we're focused on actual practices of how companies and how you're implementing your programs. And this creates that objective framework for measurement and comparison, not opinion-based, it's based upon reality. And then from those results, we then have created programmatic observations, programmatic feedback and recommendations to help you advance your program based upon those relative maturity scores. And this overall approach is going to allow us to scale our advisory services insight. Just what you just had a taste of that from Erica's conversation a moment ago, but it'll allow us to scale that same type of insight to really a large audience, but it also provides you the opportunity and capability to scale your monitoring and oversight responsibility across your enterprise. And we'll go a bit more into the scalability in just a moment. And then finally, to the far right, as you see here of the screen, we go another step forward beyond that assessment and provide tools, examples, work product actually to help you start down that path to putting those recommendations into practice. And the initial feedback we've heard so far from the pilot participants has been really positive, and we're really excited about the reaction we're getting. And the initial use cases that the Bella community is proposing for this are really quite compelling. So we'll go into those here on our next screen. So some of the use cases you'll see here in front of you. The first one over here at the top is perhaps the most obvious, which is using this framework to assess the maturity of the program at the enterprise headquarters level. And as I'm out talking with companies, I continually hear the idea that most organizations will sit down in the fall, let's say October timeframe, planning the next year's priorities. And they'll bring their key management team together for the compliance program, and they'll go write down the elements of a program. How do we feel about our training curriculum plan? How effective is our overall training? Let's look at our communication practices. What tools did we utilize last year? What's our overall level of engagement, and what should we do next year? What does our due diligence process look like? So they'll go through each piece of the program, and they'll do their own internal assessment, just thinking about it from themselves. And then they'll put together the strategy for next year. Once they then define those key initiatives, then they'll have to sit down with a blank piece of paper and say, all right, we've decided we're going to do a renewed focus on management training. Let's now create a deck on for managers, somewhat of a toolkit to help facilitate management conversations around ethics and compliance. So that's really a detailed process, an in-depth, long process for them to go from that first conversation of assessing their plan for next year and then putting in place tools to put it in action. So what we're doing here is combining all that into one experience. Another tool or use case that we're really seeing is the idea of using this to monitor the program between full assessments. So the full periodic assessments that Erica was talking about a moment ago, where you have an external consultant come in to analyze the program, look at documentation, interviews those that run the program. Most organizations do that every 3 years, as suggested by the Department of Justice. So what we're seeing companies utilize this type of a framework for is between those larger full assessments. This is a great way to keep going and keep advancing the program. The use case that I'm hearing probably the most excitement about is the third one listed here. And I talked about scale a moment ago. And I talked to so many companies that have really a global remit, global responsibilities, but they're a small team implementing and overseeing the compliance program globally. And anything that they can do, any tools that they can have to scale their capabilities is really a big win. Actually, I was just visiting with a company earlier this week, and what they do is they partner with audits and will go out to the business. They'll pick 3 or 4 different subsidiaries or business units that they'll go to each year, and they'll basically do an external assessment of that business unit themselves, and they'll go right down the elements of the program, doing a risk assessment really of the compliance program for that business unit, and helping that entity really advance their program. And that's great work that they're doing, but the difficulty is that it's really difficult to scale, especially if they have 25 or 30 different business units or subsidiaries or joint ventures or regional locations. I was talking with one company a couple of weeks ago that they'll do this regionally, and for in-country, they'll do in-country compliance reviews around the globe each year. They can only hit a few, but they operate in over 85 countries. So very difficult to scale. And what this platform here will allow companies to do is exactly that: is create a framework where they can send this assessment out to each one of those organizations, have them complete the process, and based upon their scores, they'll have a framework and recommendations of what they need to do to advance their program. So, for example, they could send it out to all the business units, and then afterwards they'll sit down with each one individually and say, when it comes to training and communication, you are at a 2.7. The rest of our entities here, your peers within our organization, they're at a 4.1. That's what our benchmark is here internally. Here are the 3 things we want you to do this next year to advance your program along the maturity scale. And then we also see this another use case around same utility for mergers and acquisition targets, joint venture partners, portfolio management firms. So really a lot of different use cases that the BELA community is talking with us about for this utility. So then, as we get into the question sets themselves and the areas of analysis, what we've done is we've divided into the 3 categories you see here in front of you. And this is really based upon the insight and feedback from the BELA community. Also, our analysis of a lot of the DOJ guidance that's out there. This is where most organizations spend most of their time focused on the strategy of their program, as well as the implementation and tactical approach of their program. So we wanted this to be a manageable approach, covering a broad, most important pieces of the program. So the question set themselves, to the far left here, resources, structure, and oversight. There's about 18 questions focused on that arena of the assessment. In the middle here, training and communication, 20 questions on those practices, and you see the types of topics in front of you. And then another 18 questions on monitoring, auditing, and risk assessment process. So 56 questions in all. It's not too time-consuming to complete, but the overall objective analysis is quite strong, as you'll see here in just a second. So let's take a look at what that framework looks like. The platform that we utilize for the maturity assessments, it's a SaaS-based platform. You just log in. It's 2-factor authentication, so very high security in place. It's very easy, intuitive to use. And what we've done is we've taken the questions that we've utilized in the past for the world's most ethical application. It's called the Ethics Quotient Survey. We've utilized that same selection of questions, but then modified them slightly to fit into this maturity assessment approach. Those questions have been curated and honed and refined over the last 12 to 13 years now. So that's helped create a data set we've talked about previously that provides that benchmarking. This serves as really the underpinning for that benchmarking and the objective, the observations and recommendations that are part of the output for the assessment process. So the input is pretty straightforward. Let's look at what the output looks like. So once companies go through the assessment process, we immediately create a report like you see here in front of you. So the findings report is about 55 pages or so based upon your responses. It's a board-ready document with both a high-level scoring across the 3 categories. but more importantly, it also has question by question observations, and those are based upon your responses compared to those best practices. Now, it also has,
Jonathan,
go ahead.
Yep, I was just going to hop in here for a second just to talk a little bit about the question selection process that we went through in order to pull these together. You know, as you guys on the line can imagine, over the course of the last decade plus, we have been looking at the questions we use as part of the ethics quotient. We get tons and tons of feedback on how those questions are worded, how they match company practices. We have a methodology committee that we work with on that. And then when we sat down to think about, okay, how do we bring these insights to the community more broadly in a way that they can use to think about their internal program design, comparing decentralized compliance programs against each other, giving tools to their compliance officers in different parts of the business to help them drive their programs forward. We spent a lot of time thinking about the question set themselves. And so this question that Jonathan's showing right now is a great example, which is, you know, how are you documenting your ethics and compliance training curriculum? So how do you design it? How do you make sure it's appropriate? Really looking at, you know, not do I think my training program or my training plan is effective, but what are the actual metrics and measures that I'm using to demonstrate that effectiveness? So, you know, as everybody in the space knows, we've been thinking and talking about effectiveness as a profession forever, and it still is an elusive target because at the end of the day, you're trying to measure whether or not your employees understand what's expected of them and will actually do what's expected of them. And there are, of course, a tremendous number of factors that go into this. But, you know, really thinking about how have I made sure that my training plan is effective? And that's what you see in front of you here. It's a multi-select question with the kinds of practices that we see other companies doing to demonstrate effectiveness of their training program. And then my personal favorite is, and this is something that my team is very passionate about, we're never just going to give you a finding and then not tell you how to fix it. So we spent a lot of time pulling together resources that are actually embedded into the report itself that allow you to think about what you're going to do with the insights that you're being provided with. So where are the resources? Who's doing this well? How do I actually pull this together in a way that makes sense for my organization? And Jonathan's actually showing you guys what the report itself looks like and what some of those resources might be. So it's a combination of work that we've done here at Ethisphere and some of the work that the community has pulled together. If you are a member of the community, you'll have access to those pieces as well. And again, as I said, this is meant to be efficient and effective. And in my opinion, at least, you can't have both of those things if we don't tell you how we see other companies addressing a particular gap.
Great. Thank you, Erica. Yeah, now I was going to just echo the output here. So this is just an example from the actual report where and we'll send out a redacted version of this as well, so you can get your hands on this and feel more familiar with what the observations look like, what the recommendations look like. But then, as Erica was mentioning, at the tail end of each of these questions, we will then provide links to resources that are on the Bella Resource Center. So for Bella members, you'll have access to tools, could be sample policies, manager toolkits, sample risk assessment framework or methodology that companies are putting in place. So actual work product that has been curated from the Bella community gives you a tremendous head start on putting some of these recommendations into place. So great. So as you see here, you can probably understand why we're really excited about this program maturity index. The reaction, as I said, is from the pilot members has been really, really positive. It's a short experience to complete the survey, but the output is both high level in terms of guidance and the maturity scores on a question by question level with the recommendations and resources provide just tremendous action planning for them, first for the enterprise program, but then as they look to specific business units or entities across the organization, again, is going to really help them scale their capabilities. So the next obvious question, or before I move on, any other additions you might want to add, Erica, to the framework and the output?
No other questions related to the framework and the output, but we did get a good question from the floor, which is, does the survey include any questions about budget? So budget and FTE is probably the single most commonly requested piece of data from us. And so we do get that focused fact request from the Bella community a lot, and it is certainly something that we have data on, depending on how you define peer. And so, for those of you who are Bella members, that information is available right now on the Member Hub for costs. Now, from a breakdown perspective, we go into where are the primary buckets of costs. We don't get as granular as what would be your technology budget for assessment platforms, but we can certainly give you broad strokes on how peer companies of yours are budgeting.
Great. Okay. Well, so we're coming towards the end here of our session, but before we part ways, the next natural question that we're getting is, how is this being priced for the market? What's the licensing approach? Now, this is early days for us. We're just now launching this, and we've been talking to the market, just recently. But the framework for licensing, we will have a single-use license. Most organizations are really talking to us about multi-use capabilities. So we're creating a bucketed approach to licensing. So you might want to license five keys or 5 instances of program assessment. Or 10 or 25 or more, and so forth. So we're really interested in your feedback. So what we'll be doing is, at the close of the call, we'll be sending out to you the recording of this presentation. We'll be sending out the slides, of course, but we'll also be sending you a redacted report. And then we'll be reaching out to you, hoping to set a conversation. We're really interested in your feedback and how you might look to utilize this framework within your organization. Again, it's early days for us, but we're really interested in interacting with the market and seeing where this takes both of us. Erica, before we wrap, any other comments before we move to close the call?
I think the only other thing, we got one more question that did come in from the floor, which is, how are the companies that have gone through this process thus far thinking about using the results and the feedback? Because we have had about a half a dozen companies take this as a pilot program. And, the particular question that we got was, what are those companies, the pilot companies, thinking about in terms of the ways in which they're actually going to use the feedback going forward? And it's a really, really good question, because it's one thing to go through a process like this. It's another thing entirely to put the process into execution. And so the ways in which we see companies looking at this particular use case is, it's got a couple, the way in which one of the companies that went through the pilot said is they're looking to use it to help support pitches to senior leaders to talk about enhancements and the need for additional resources. Particularly when it comes to the benchmarking component of it, knowing that you may be off of either the overall benchmark or your particular company's benchmark. So again, if we think of a use case where you have different business units that are engaged in running their own component pieces of a program, I might be responsible for the program in one part of the world, and I am not keeping up with what my colleagues at the company are doing, never mind what the rest of the world is up to. Understanding kind of where those particular gaps are and getting the resources that we particularly need to make sure that we close gaps that are identified. I think one of my favorite sayings in this particular context is the plural of anecdote is not data. And so many of the things that come up in this kind of assessment work or this kind of benchmarking work are things that you already know, right? If any one of you on the line, if we sat down in a room with nobody around and I asked you, where do you think your key gaps are? I am betting that in almost every case, you could nail most of them, if not all of them, right? But it's different to think about whether that's something that you can document, that it is actually a gap, and make the business case to get the resources that you need to close it. So that's really, at the end of the day, what we're trying to help companies do here. Yeah, so that's the only thing I would add, Jonathan, in response to that particular use case question. It's a good one, and that's what we're hearing the most from the companies that have had the opportunity to go through this already.
Wonderful. Well, very good. Well, thank you all again for attending today. I hope you found some insight from both the conversation and data around how companies are assessing their program periodically. And, again, we'll be sending a follow-up email here in the next day or so with a link to this presentation, the slides that we reviewed today, as well as the recording. And you'll also see a sample report of the assessment. So look for that coming your way. And again, if any other questions or commentary, please feel free to reach out to us, and we will talk again soon. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you all.